So people rotating into U.S. equities. So let's rotate a little bit around the world towards the United Kingdom. Bank of England Governor Mark Carney, his most recent speech, it seems that he might have to work a little bit more to convince markets regarding his main proposition that until unemployment hits, according to him, or to the MPC, 7% by the end of 2016, I believe it is, he will not move the bank rate. Some people say that he might have a credibility problem. Some people say perhaps he inherited a credibility problem. In either case, where do you stand on this subject?
Well, I think you're exactly right in that he inherited a credibility problem. I think Mark Carney's credibility in himself is actually extremely good from his work at the Bank of Canada.
Okay.
But the problem is that the Bank of England doesn't really have too much credibility. There's been questions raised for the last couple of years over the effectiveness of quantitative easing, and yet they continue to pursue only quantitative easing, no unconventional measures. But then Mark Carney's come in and he's gone with forward guidance instead. But the problem is his hands were really tied with this forward guidance because he had to have a caveat in relation to inflation because it's so volatile in the UK and it has historically been very volatile. And it's already at 2.8%, so it's already well above the 2% target which the Bank of England does have. So there had to be that caveat of yes, we're going to have this forward guidance, but there has to be a caveat in relation to inflation, and that was 2.5% in the next 18 months to 2 years. But the problem that markets have had with this is firstly, 0.8% drop in unemployment isn't necessarily that significant, even for the UK that has an issue with productivity, so the chances are companies are going to fix the issue of productivity before they start hiring more, so which means it is probably going to be slower than the US. But we've seen a 1% drop in unemployment in the US in the last 12 months, so a 0.8% drop, to give it a three-year timeline doesn't seems far too much. So he hasn't really given that assurances to businesses, to households, to consumers that he was really looking for, because you've got the issue with inflation, the fact that it could come back, their expectations could come back to rise above 2.5% quite easily when it's already 0.3% above this level. But again, that's very subjective. So how can people have confidence in something they can't measure themselves? They want something objective, something they can really quantify. But then there's the problem, like I say, with the unemployment rate. I think there's people just aren't assured by what Mark Carney said, and I think there was also one more caveat of if the Bank of England see any reason why they need to change this forward guidance, they can as well. So I mean, I think people just weren't assured in any way, shape or form, and we saw that reaction in the market. Sterling rallied after this forward guidance. That's you never see that. Whether if you see quantitative easing, if you see forward guidance from the Federal Reserve, from when we saw the large asset purchases from the Bank of Japan, we see a weakening in the currency. And following Mark Carney's forward guidance, it was all rallying in the pound, which I think that speaks volumes. But you've got to feel for the guy. He's got great credibility in himself, but I think his hands were really tied on this one. He's done everything he can, and we're only a month after now, and already we're talking about, he mentioned quantitative easing this week again, that could be another option if forward guidance doesn't work. So that just shows that we had plan A for 3-4 years, he tried plan B, and 1 month later we're looking at plan A already, and that suggests that his hands are really tied and there's not a lot he can do.
Yeah, I feel the threshold that they put on the unemployment rate to drop below 7%, and they're looking at it around the end of 2016 is way too ambitious. I read that's around about the UK economy has to generate somewhere between the region of 750,000 to 800,000 jobs in 3 years to reach that target before the unemployment rate falls to about 7%. Now, given the fact that UK companies are still deleveraging, streamlining their businesses and cutting costs and also cutting staff, it's very difficult to kind of see how the UK labour market can generate somewhere in the region of 800,000 jobs in 3 years only. I reckon it's probably going to be about 4 to 5 years before we actually see that 800,000.
Okay, so you see Mr. Carney erring, but in the opposite direction.
I think it's an ambitious target. I think they're going to have to at some point adjust that target again. I don't think they'll be able to reach 7% in 3 years.
Interesting.
It'll get down to about 7.2, I reckon, in 2016. But then again, you know, central banks, we've seen the Fed being a little bit more flexible with their thresholds and their targets as well. The Fed said at the start of, Ben Bernanke in his testimony stated 6.5% would be the level that they would look at on the unemployment rate before they really let go of QE.
Indeed.
However, now we've got talk in September that we might see tapering and the unemployment rate is at 7.4%, still 0.9% off the target of the Fed's target. So I mean, who's to say when Carney is going to actually start tightening policies? He's at his recent comments at the University of Nottingham. He made it clear that just even if the unemployment rate edges below 7%, that does not automatically mean that we're going to start hiking
That was very
rates.
important. Indeed.
Yeah, so obviously suggests that they're going to be watching the unemployment rate like a hawk, and of course it's not a preset level that they're looking at before there's an automatic tightening of monetary policies. They may monitor the conditions of the labour market for a few months extra before they actually really start adjusting policies.
Okay, that's certainly key. Moving to another risk factor, or not, the Eurozone. We have the German elections coming up. There's a lot of instability in some Club Med countries, or not, you will tell me. However, some people have said that there might be risks in the next elections, that small parties might upset a certain comfortable equilibrium in German politics. I've heard you make on previous occasions very interesting comments as far as the German political system and the faith of their electorate in the government, which seems to be rather at odds with all of those informations, all that news flow.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's that saying that most Germans believe in God, but all Germans believe in the Bundestag. So they're deeply committed to what their politicians have to say. I think there's going to be no change in the status quo. And Craig and I were talking about how the relative calm in the Eurozone periphery, the fact that we haven't seen any flare-ups of tensions when it comes to not only the political side of things, but also on the sovereign debt side, has made it relatively easy for Angela Merkel. And then when you put on top the fact that Germany just recently posted 0.7% growth for the second quarter, it's music to the ears of the Russian Democratic Party and Angela Merkel. She's in for a clear win. She's on 60%. That's in terms of in the polling. Yes, there is
a record, no?
From what I can see, yeah, it's a record from what I've read as well. There is, of course, anti-Euro and anti-Euro, not anti-German, but anti-Euro parties out there who are looking for the Germany to either go back to the Deutschmark or for the removal of Greece or other weaker peripheral countries in the Eurozone, but they account for about 2% of the polling and influence in German politics at the moment and with the German public. The German public have a little choice when it comes to their politicians, as all politicians are really fighting for the same thing. That there's very small differences in their policies. They are pro-Euro. They are pro-Germany funding the Eurozone mess. German banks are going to write down some 80 billion worth of peripheral debt, and Germans at the moment are taking it in great character because they have faith in Merkel, and as long as we don't see a bust up in the Eurozone, they're going to continue having that faith. But again, next year Greece is going to be up for review if it can continue on its budget reform targets and please the Troika, then the Germans will continue backing it. But if we see it fall behind, then all of a sudden we're going to start seeing some of that negative news flow come back in, and some anti-Merkel rhetoric being spewed.
So then the key here is that Greece does not fall behind in its program?
So of course for Germany's fate is tied heavily to the fate of its peripheral neighbours. It needs its peripheral neighbours to do well. That's why it's funding so much money to these guys. So it's imperative that Portugal, Greece, Spain, they all remain on top of their budget.
And for us as well.
Absolutely. And they oblige to the conditions of the Troika that have been set out, and they get to the point where they can essentially be let go and they are posting sustainable growth. It's going to take some time. Eurozone GDP came out recently for the second quarter. There was growth of 0.3%. Welcome news. Will probably stagnate for a good year before we actually really see sustainable growth. But the rate of contraction in Spain particularly has eased somewhat, with GDP coming in for 0.1% on the contraction side. Much better than what the market was expecting. Even the Bank of Spain managed to get their projections right this time around. And that's the same case. Yeah, and that's the same case with Italy as well. Though there is worries on the political level, the manufacturing and industrial activity is picking up. So it seems like, at the moment, good news for Mario Draghi, good news for Eurozone policymakers, good news for Merkel. As long as things stay quiet on the sovereign debt front and the political situation stays stable, there's nothing to be worried about just yet on the Eurozone front. You're just going to have to wait till some of that anti-Euro rhetoric kind of starts flaring up in nations like Portugal, where it's most likely and most vulnerable.
So that risk does still exist.
That risk is going to be on board for the next 5 to 10 years.
Right.
So long as there's hardship for these nations and people suffering at the hands of strict reforms and strict austerity measures, you're always going to have the possibility of the removal of a pro-Euro government in place. So, Germany's watching that situation very carefully. Greece, Portugal, Spain, and Italy are always going to be under threat.
All right, Craig?
I think it's very interesting. Like, I completely agree with what you're saying. I think one thing that's really interesting with Angela Merkel is it was something that I read recently that with people in Germany, they don't necessarily understand everything that Angela Merkel and the CDU party are doing, especially in relation to the Eurozone, but they all have, or at least the majority have, faith in that what she's doing, she believes is in the best interest of the country. Because, I mean, if you take a look at a lot of other countries, not just in the Eurozone, you can look at the UK and the US as well, people don't share that same belief. Germany's hit hard times by what they've become accustomed to over the most recent history anyway, and yet people are still very confident that Angela Merkel is acting in the best interests of Germany as a whole. You look at the UK and the same can't be said here. Labour are still ahead in the polls despite the fact that they were in power in the lead up to 2008 and only left power in 2010, and yet they're leading in the polls right now. We look in some of the other countries and we've got these smaller parties gaining pace in the polls, and we've got the likes of Francois Hollande coming in France, and immediately within months of coming into power is falling behind dramatically in the polls because people lose faith quite quickly. So, I mean, obviously they have the benefit, they've got lower unemployment and they do still have growth in the Eurozone, but in Germany. But it is really quite interesting to see that people do have so much faith in Angela Merkel, which is why she's got such a lead in the polls and why there really is no threat of anyone else really taking that away from her. I think two things as well. She's been very fortunate in the timing of certain things, mainly growth in the Eurozone, the return. It was only recently came out that the Eurozone grew by 0.3% in the second quarter. That's fantastic timing considering it's been in recession for the last year. Before that it was stagnating. So it's fantastic timing that the Eurozone exits recession just before the German elections. We've also seen great growth in Germany. So again, fantastic timing. But then she's been very intelligent about the way she's done things as well, with, like we said earlier, the fact that there's been no flare-ups in the Eurozone, and I don't think that's a mistake. I think that's been calculated. I think any issues that have arisen, I think they've been quietly put onto the back burner for now. The likes of Portugal, the likes of Greece now coming out with this 11 billion shortfall. I think they've been very intelligent, and I think they've been a little bit fortunate at the same time. And as a result, there's absolutely no threat of a smaller party like we've got UKIP in the UK, like Syriza in Germany. There's no real threat of any of them taking away any of the share of the vote from Merkel, because there's no need.
Okay, good news on that front. And then lastly, since we're running a little bit short on time now, but I believe it's very important to approach the subject, the Middle East, geopolitical tensions in Syria. Each of you, let's start with Craig, for example. How dangerous is it? Short-term problem, medium-term problem? Which of the two?
It has the potential to be very serious. I think that's the most important thing. Anytime we do see these flare-ups in the Middle East, they've got great potential to be quite disastrous, and that's why we saw such a huge reaction in the markets over the last couple of days. We saw that panic of how quickly and how massively it can escalate if, say, the West do impose these military strikes on Syria. What will the reaction of Iran be? What will the reaction of Israel be? I mean, that has great potential to really flare up. I'm not necessarily convinced right now that it will do, though. As I said earlier, there's not much support in the UK or the US, especially among the public. I think there was a survey done recently that showed 50% of the UK public are against any kind of military strike, and only 25% are in support of military strikes. We saw in Parliament the fact that Labour voted against any action without any hard evidence, and even some of David Cameron's own party voted against it as well. So I don't think there's necessarily any threat in the short term, and I think that's what we're starting to see again, that reaction that we're seeing in the markets with that we're starting to see those losses disappear. We saw actually gains in the equity markets today, and I think people feel a little bit better about this whole situation. But obviously in the long term there's always going to be potential for further deterioration in the Middle East, and that's going to have an impact especially on the oil markets, which goes without saying. There's always going to be potential for further flare-ups without a shadow of doubt.
I completely agree with Craig, and I think that the spectre of the horrible past that the West had to the credibility that they lost through the Iraq War by entering Iraq and removing Saddam Hussein at the time, and then finding out there was no legitimate case for weapons of mass destruction. I don't want to repeat the mistake of the past. And I think what's interesting with this situation is that Assad has been able to buy some time, and he's clinging on to whatever power he can, but he's bought some time with the help of the Russians and the help of the Chinese by not publicly endorsing him, but by backing him for their own financial and strategic reasons. By backing Assad, they've been able to tell the Americans and the Western forces that they have no legitimate grounds to enter Syria at this point right now. And while the Russians and Chinese continue that rhetoric, the Americans are haunted by their past, the Brits are haunted by their past, so they have to really consider it. They really have to put into consideration before they go into these countries and into Syria, and also the fact that a country like America and the UK, we're growing. The UK is showing signs of growth. The US is showing signs of growth. But one of the things that has to take a cut is defence spending. And the US have been cutting back on defence spending, and so have the UK. And it's not. We don't have the money anymore to spend so aggressively on defence that we used to. So the UK and the US needs to really deeply consider going into Syria before and actually having the legitimate grounds to do this before they can actually take any sort of action. I think the key that the market is looking here is of course the oil price and what this means for oil prices now.
Where do you see it going?
Well, I mean, some people are saying 125 on Brent. I reckon it could potentially reach 125. It's 115 right now. I still think it's somewhat overdone. I think it'll only reach 125 if this situation escalates to a point where we don't see any sort of exit of the US and Western forces from Syria, and they're there to stay, and it becomes a similar sort of situation like Iraq, where they occupy Syria for a prolonged period and it's indefinite, and we don't know when the US are going to exit the country. If it does go up to 125, that will make it very interesting, because then that has the potential to derail the global economy, as the spike in oil prices will start filtering into businesses, personal and household, to spending, to the consumer market, near enough most facets of the economy, and then the inflationary pressures that poses essentially makes it a very difficult environment for the global economy to continue posting the growth that it is. And I guess what that would mean would be that the Fed will have to hold back from tapering anytime soon, because they have no reason to. If the U.S. economy is starting to show signs of weakness due to oil prices spiking, then they're going to have to really consider if it's the right time to taper.
So real fears of Fed tapering, and on the other hand, the end game might be, in the short term at least, U.S. weakness and no tapering, really. No need for it.
No need for it, yeah.
Okay. Gentlemen, thank you very, very much for joining us again.
Thank you.
We hope to have you again with us soon, and have a very, very pleasant evening. It was a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And to all of our viewers, thank you very much for joining us once again. Until next week, from Digital Look TV in London, thank you.